Devan Murugan is at the eNCA Money Desk. Devan, good afternoon to you. The latest corporate transparency report is out. It's compiled by Corruption Watch. How's corporate South Africa doing?
Not too well, Jeremy. Private companies that are not listed on the JSE have been flagged in a new study by Corruption Watch and the National Business Initiative. The companies which are not governed by transparency regulation have performed poorly in the latest anti-corruption rankings. But the anti-corruption advocacy group saying there is also a big gap in the scores of the best performing listed companies and the average score. So in a study of 100 local companies, corporate South Africa produced a score of around an average 59%. The average of the top 5 performing companies on the transparency front is 85%. So indeed a very big gap between what the average is and what the big companies are producing. Now, this report uses public information to rank companies on 3 major themes. You see it in front of you. Their anti-corruption programs and campaigns, organizational transparency. That basically includes the information provided about subsidiary companies, for example. And the other last theme there is the country-by-country reporting. So let's get more detail now from Corruption Watch Executive Director David Lewis. David, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Just under 10 years ago, one couldn't find a local company in corruption reports. And you've said this in your webinar earlier. This has drastically changed. Tongaat, KPMG, Steinhoff. Is corporate South Africa failing in terms of transparency?
Well, I think that they have failed in a way. Although South Africa doesn't do bad in transparency rankings, largely as a result of the King Code of Governance, which is a world-class standard in good governance. But they haven't done that well on the reporting. And true enough, up until 3-4 years ago, the only South African companies that you heard about were you were beginning to hear about Oak Bay, which I think was a criminal conspiracy rather than a company. But you never really heard about the kind of blue chip companies we're hearing about today, the KPMGs, McKinseys, Tongaat, Hewlett, Steinhoff. These are relatively new. Even the arms deal, the vast majority of companies involved were big multinationals not based in South Africa. Now we've been hearing much more about corporate South Africa, and I think, it has been, the fact of the matter is that we hear about them every day. And we've got to look into ourselves and look at our corporates and ask ourselves whether they've taken the low road rather than the high road. And it would seem that by some of the examples set, that many important South African corporates have taken the low road.
Where are the big deficits as we bring this to the latest survey in some of these companies that you've surveyed? I see you are not impressed with the quality of answers when these companies are asked to provide details on, let's assume, the incidence of corruption and their training efforts for that matter. Where are the deficits here?
Well, those are amongst them. I mean, there's a lack of detail about, for example, what is the incidence of corruption in your company, which would be very helpful. I mean, we've found a bit of a tendency for companies to try and deal with actual incidents of corruption in a very private setting. They seem to think that they would get a worse rap from the public for showing that there is corruption in our company, rather than a good rap for saying that I'm actually dealing with corruption and I'm telling you that I'm dealing with it and how I'm dealing with it. There's a bit of a tendency to sweep these under the carpet when they involve high-ranking officials, or at best to allow it to be resolved in a very private manner. So the high-ranking official goes on to the next company and conducts himself there in the same way. Also, extreme reticence to talk about political contributions, for example, which is something that we really have to get to grips with, because this is a very corrupting force, monetary contributions to political parties. So there are big gaps, and we hope that a report like this will inspire people to look, other companies to look at how the best 5 performed, for example, and what you do to get develop a good reputation in this area, and that they'll start to think closely if they're willing to report on environmental, social, and governance issues as the JSE requires them. Why not report on corruption issues? And indeed, why does the JSE not require them to report on corruption issues?
Which brings me to my final question very quickly, and my apologies for interrupting. It then leads on to what you said in your webinar this morning. You took exception to the notion, as someone put it in there, that the highest order of these huge corporations are seemingly unaware of irregular activity. You say that's often not the case.
No, I think that they absolutely are. You know, where you find cases of grand corruption, company like EOH, there's no way that the most senior executives didn't know what was going on in their company. I used the example of McKinsey there. You know, the McKinsey-Eskom deal was the largest deal that Eskom did that McKinsey did in Africa. Are you trying to tell me that the chief executive of McKinsey didn't look at this and say, wow, this was very impressive. How did we do this? Oh, we did this by cutting in a politically connected company and gave them 600 million rand for nothing. You know, I think the chief executives know when something unusual happens, and in the case of grand corruption, that is usually landing a deal larger than any deal you've ever landed before. The chief executives know exactly how it was achieved.
All right, I'm afraid that's all we have time for now. This has a lot of legs in it, David. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us. David Lewis from Corruption Watch.